I don't remember my mother by dates. I remember her by a sound. A gunshot. May 9th, 1914, echoing through a Santa Barbara mansion, and the rest of her life becoming a ledger overnight. $20 million. Not to spend, to carry. She was 27, in an America that still doubted women with power, especially women who knew how to use it. She learned to turn tragedy into a system, buy brands the way other people buy time, build palaces like armor, marry 4 times like signing 4 contracts, and still sit alone with the one thing no fortune can negotiate. And then came Moscow. Stalin. Rooms with microphones in the walls, where even a dinner party had to whisper, while my mother paid in sealed wooden crates, buying back the remains of a murdered empire, one artifact at a time. The world called her an American empress, but I knew the truth. She was simply moving faster than that first gunshot, long enough to turn it into a legacy. Chapter 1. The Shadow of the Founder. The Apprentice of the Mahogany Circle. The library here at Hillwood is silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the French clocks. But in my mind, the air is thick with the scent of 1914, a mixture of salt air, gunpowder, and the heavy, sweet aroma of roasted grain. Long before she was the woman who dined with Stalin or the Empress of Mar-a-Lago, my mother was a project. She was a biological asset meticulously engineered by my grandfather, Charles William Post, to succeed where he feared he would fail, to understand the iron will that eventually ruled American wealth. One must look past the glittering ballrooms and into the suffocating, smoke-filled rooms where a 10-year-old girl was forced to trade her childhood for a seat at the head of the table. It began in Battle Creek, Michigan, a town that smelled of ambition and toasted bran. By 1897, while other children were learning to navigate the social graces of the playground, Marjorie was being tutored in the brutal geometry of the balance sheet. C.W. Post was a man of nervous energy, a Victorian term for a soul that vibrated with a restlessness that bordered on madness. He had no son to carry the mantle of his rising postum empire, and in his desperation, he turned his only daughter into a titan. He didn't want a girl. He wanted a successor. Her education was a baptism by fire. From the age of 10, she was required to attend every board meeting. Imagine a child, her hair in ribbons and her pinafore perfectly pressed, sitting on a chair too large for her, surrounded by a dozen men in black frock coats. The air was a gray soup of cigar smoke, thick, acrid, and masculine. These men didn't see a child. They saw a ghost of C.W.'s future. My grandfather would stand at the head of the mahogany table and point to a ledger with a trembling finger. "Look at the freight costs, Marjorie," he would command. "If the rail lines in Ohio strike tomorrow, tell me how we redirect the shipment of grape nuts to the Atlantic seaboard without losing a cent of margin." He didn't want a yes from her. He wanted a calculation. She was forced to learn the vocabulary of industry, inventory, accounts receivable, distribution networks, and the dark art of predatory advertising before she had even mastered the art of a proper curtsy. On the carriage rides back to their modest home, C.W. would grill her. He would ask her why he had rejected a certain supplier, or how many lines of copy should be dedicated to the health benefits of postum in the New York newspapers. If she hesitated, the carriage remained silent. He was sharpening her mind like a surgeon's scalpel, removing the softness of childhood and replacing it with the cold, unyielding steel of corporate logic. She was also sent to the factory floors. She told me she could still feel the vibration of the machinery in her bones decades later. C.W. made her walk the production lines where women, many not much older than herself, toiled in the heat of the ovens. "Those women depend on your brain, Marjorie," he would say, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "If you make a mistake in the boardroom, their children don't eat in the kitchen." It was a staggering weight to place on a young girl's heart. He was teaching her that wealth was not a playground, but a fortress that required constant, vigilant maintenance. She learned to see people as units of productivity and brands as sacred trusts. She was a 10-year-old executive, a miniature sovereign who knew the price of a bushel of wheat before she knew the name of a single friend. But the man who built her was falling apart. C.W. Post had spent his life selling health in a box, yet he was a man colonized by pain. His stomach was a knot of agony that no doctor could untie. By the early 1914, the Postum King was a hollowed-out version of the man who had revolutionized the American breakfast. He had preached the gospel of positive thinking to millions, yet he was drowning in a sea of his own shadows. The end came with a chilling, clinical precision. After a desperate 2,000-mile journey in a private rail car to the Mayo Clinic for a surgery that provided no relief, my grandfather returned to his winter mansion in Santa Barbara. The date was May 9th, 1914. The Pacific sun was likely blinding, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floors of the estate. C.W. didn't leave a sprawling manifesto or a tearful apology. He walked to his gun collection, selected a rifle, and used the same methodical efficiency he used to build his empire to end his suffering. The news shattered the American financial world. The headlines screamed of the tragic end of the serial king. But while the public mourned the man, the predators on Wall Street turned their eyes toward the daughter. Marjorie was 27 years old. She had 2 young daughters of her own and a husband, Edward Close, who was a respectable lawyer but possessed none of the fire of the Post lineage. The vultures assumed that the heiress would be a victim of her own grief. They expected a fire sale. They prepared their bids, assuming a young woman in 1914 would naturally shrink away from the grit of the factory and the roar of the market. They had forgotten about the 10-year-old girl in the smoke-filled room. On May 15th, the day of the funeral, the town of Battle Creek was a sea of black umbrellas. Thousands of workers stood in a chilling rain as C.W. Post's casket was carried into a 6,300-ton granite mausoleum. It cost $100,000, a fortune for a tomb, and inside, the walls were lined with Victoria white granite. It was a cold, magnificent cage for a man who couldn't find peace. My mother stood there, her face a mask of impenetrable calm. She wasn't just burying a father, she was burying the last of her doubts. The inheritance was a staggering $20 million, a figure that, when adjusted for the purchasing power of today, exceeds $500 million. But the money was the least of it. She inherited a controlling interest in the Postum Cereal Company. In an era when women were still fighting for the right to vote, when they were legally barred from many corporate boards, and when a woman's place was strictly defined by the domestic sphere, Marjorie Merriweather Post walked into the boardroom. The first meeting after the funeral was legendary in our family. The directors sat in the mahogany-paneled room, papers spread out before them, ready to explain to the poor girl how they would manage her affairs. They had buyout offers from rivals already drafted, but my mother didn't take the seat offered to the side. She walked to the head of the table, to C.W.'s chair. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for advice. She opened the master ledger, her black-gloved fingers moving across the pages with the grace of a pianist. She looked up at the circle of startled men and told them, in a voice that held the chill of a Michigan winter, that there would be no sale. She began to ask questions about the grain contracts in the Midwest and the advertising rates in the California papers. She found a discrepancy in the shipping logs that 3 senior directors had missed. At that moment, the men in the room realized that the heiress was gone. In her place stood the apprentice. She took that $20 million and treated it as a war chest. She understood that she was now the guardian of a legacy that required her to be more than a woman. It required her to be an institution. While she mourned the man who had raised her, she honored the titan who had trained her. She stayed in that boardroom for hours, long after the men had exhausted their arguments. She was moving faster than that first gunshot, turning her father's tragic end into the foundation of a new, more expansive empire. She had spent 17 years as a shadow in her father's boardrooms, and now, the shadow had stepped into the light to take command. The gunshot had stopped my grandfather's heart, but it had ignited a fire in my mother that would burn for 60 years, consuming anything and anyone who dared to think she was merely a rich girl. She was Marjorie Merriweather Post, and she was just beginning to rewrite the rules of American wealth. Chapter 2. The Matriarch of the Meal. The Alchemy of the Cold and the General Foods Empire. If the first chapter of my mother's life was written in the ink of mourning and the dust of the Battle Creek barn, the second was forged in the fire of high-stakes acquisition. By the early 1920s, Marjorie had already proven she could maintain a fortress. Now, she set out to conquer a continent. She realized that the 20th century was accelerating, and the American housewife was no longer content to be a slave to the wood-burning stove. My mother didn't just want to sell a box of cereal. She wanted to own the very concept of the American pantry. This was not merely business. It was a social revolution orchestrated from a mahogany desk. The catalyst for this expansion was her marriage to my father, Edward Francis Hutton, the legendary E.F. Hutton of Wall Street. To the gossip columns, it was the wedding of the century. But to the world of commerce, it was the merger of the century. My father brought the aggressive, ticker-tape intellect of a stockbroker who had built the second largest brokerage firm in the United States. He understood how to move capital like a grandmaster moves chess pieces. But it was my mother who provided the industrial soul. She was the one who understood the product, the factory floor, and the psychology of the woman standing in the grocery aisle. Together, they embarked on a series of acquisitions that were unprecedented in their scale and vision. They didn't just buy companies. They hunted for household names, brands that carried a sacred trust with the public. In 1925, they acquired Jell-O, the America's most famous dessert. Then came Maxwell House Coffee, with its good-to-the-last-drop promise that had allegedly enchanted Teddy Roosevelt. They followed with Baker's Chocolate, a company that had been producing cocoa since before the American Revolution. Hellmann's Mayonnaise, Log Cabin Syrup, Calumet Baking Powder. One by one, these giants fell under the banner of the Postum Cereal Company. My mother's strategy was surgical. She would identify a brand with a flawless reputation, but perhaps a stagnant distribution network. She would buy it, apply the massive logistical power of the Postum infrastructure, and flood the market. She was the one who insisted that the quality remain impeccable. If we put the Post name on it, even invisibly, she told the board, it must be the gold standard. We are not selling calories. We are selling a promise of excellence. By 1929, the company had outgrown its name. It was no longer just a cereal company. It became the General Foods Corporation, a title that reflected her ambition to feed the entire nation from sunrise to sunset. But the defining moment of her career, the gamble that proved she was a visionary and not just a collector of companies, happened aboard a yacht. We were sailing on the Hussar, our floating palace, off the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts. It was the mid-20s, a time of excess and elegance. During a dinner at sea, the cook served a goose that was remarkably succulent, tasting as if it had been prepared in the height of the autumn season. Though we were months away from it, my mother, possessing the restless curiosity of her father, sent for the cook. "Where did this bird come from?" she demanded. The answer was a name that would soon be in every freezer in the world: Clarence Birdseye. Birdseye was a fur trader and inventor who had spent years in the frozen wilderness of Labrador. He had observed the Inuit people catching fish in 50 below zero winds. The fish would freeze almost instantly as they hit the air. When they were thawed and cooked months later, they were indistinguishable from a fresh catch. Birdseye had spent years trying to replicate this flash freezing process industrially, using a system of chilled pressure plates that prevented the formation of large ice crystals, the jagged shards that usually turned frozen food into a mushy, unpalatable mess. My father was deeply skeptical. He saw the logistical nightmare. In the 1920s, the American infrastructure for cold storage was non-existent. Grocery stores didn't have freezers. They had ice boxes. Delivery trucks were not refrigerated. Most American homes still relied on the iceman to deliver blocks of frozen water for their cabinets. To invest in Birdseye was to invest in a world that hadn't been built yet. "It's a $20 million hole in the ocean, Marjorie," he famously warned her. He saw a financial sinkhole. She saw the liberation of the American woman. She saw a future where a mother in a sweltering New York apartment could serve her children fresh spinach in the middle of July. She saw a world where seasonality was a choice, not a constraint. For years, she pushed the board of General Foods to make the move. She analyzed Birdseye's patents with the same clinical precision she had used as a 10-year-old auditing grain contracts. She recognized that this wasn't just a new product. It was a new category of human existence. The negotiations were grueling. As Birdseye's technology matured, the price tag climbed. Other competitors began to circle. But my mother refused to let go. In June of 1929, just months before the Great Crash would shiver the foundations of the world, General Foods acquired the Birdseye General Seafoods Corporation for approximately $22 million. It was a staggering sum, nearly 10 times what she had originally proposed years earlier. But she was undeterred. She oversaw the massive investment required to build the cold chain from scratch. She insisted on the creation of specialized freezer cases for grocery stores, often leasing them to retailers at a loss just to seed the market. She was the first to realize that you couldn't just sell the food. You had to build the entire ecosystem to support it. As I sit here in the library of Hillwood, I realize that this was the pinnacle of her business matriarch era. She was the first woman to serve on the board of a major American corporation, and she wasn't there to take notes. She was the one driving the locomotive of innovation. She had taken the $20 million her father left her and, through General Foods, multiplied it into a fortune that made the original inheritance look like petty cash. She lived like an empress, yes. She wore the diamonds of Marie Antoinette and built the palaces of Mar-a-Lago and Hillwood. But her true throne was the American dinner table. She had transformed the cereal empire into a global pantry. Every time a person opens a freezer door, they are walking through a door my mother opened in 1929. She had moved faster than that first gunshot, far beyond the reach of the predators who thought she was just a rich girl. She was the architect of the modern way of life, a woman who understood that in the 20th century, power belonged to those who could control the passage of time, and she had frozen time itself in a box. Throughout this period, she maintained a schedule that would have broken a lesser person. She would spend her mornings reviewing financial reports with my father, her afternoons at the architect's office, planning our next estate, and her evenings hosting dinners for the titans of industry. She never forgot the lessons of Battle Creek. Attention to detail is the difference between a business and a legacy. She was the matriarch of the meal, and the empire she built was as cold as ice and as solid as the granite mausoleum where her father lay. She had done what C.W. never could. She had found a way to make the Post name eternal, not through a drink, but through a total transformation of how the world lived. Chapter 3. The Floating Fortress. The white sails of the sea cloud and the sovereignty of the deep. If the kitchens of America were my mother's boardroom, the open ocean was her cathedral. To the world, she was a woman of marble halls and velvet curtains. But I remember her most vividly against a backdrop of endless blue, her hair whipped by a gale, standing on the deck of the largest private sailing yacht ever built. My childhood was not measured in city blocks or school semesters. It was measured in knots, in the creak of towering masts, and in the silent, moonlit expanses of the Galapagos and the Baltic. The Sea Cloud, originally christened the Hussar V, was not merely a boat. It was a statement of absolute independence, a four-masted barquet that allowed Marjorie Merriweather Post to carry her world with her, untethered from the shore. The genesis of the Sea Cloud began in 1929, just as the world's economy was beginning to fracture. While others were retrenching, my mother and my father, E.F. Hutton, were dreaming of a vessel that would surpass any royal yacht in Europe. They commissioned the project from the Krupp Germania Werft shipyard in Kiel, Germany, a place more accustomed to building warships than pleasure craft. My mother approached the design with the same terrifying attention to detail she applied to the General Foods test kitchens. She didn't just want a pretty ship, she wanted a masterpiece of marine engineering. I remember her taking a course in naval architecture just so she could speak the language of the shipwrights. She wouldn't be told that a certain arrangement was impossible. In a massive warehouse in Brooklyn, she had the blueprints of every cabin drawn on the floor at a 1-to-1 scale. She moved actual furniture into these chalk-drawn boxes, walking through the imaginary hallways for weeks to ensure that the flow of a dinner party wouldn't be disrupted by a narrow bulkhead. She was designing a stage for the 20th century's elite, and she knew that on the water, there is no room for a mistake in judgment. When the ship was launched in April 1931, it was a Titan, 316 feet in length, with a mainmast that rose 178 feet into the sky. It carried 29 sails, a staggering 36,000 square feet of canvas that, when unfurled, looked like a great white cloud descending upon the waves. It required a crew of 72 professionals to maintain the rig and the domestic perfection my mother demanded. But the engineering was only half the story. The interiors were where my mother's imperial soul truly manifested. Her private suite was a sanctuary of white Carrara marble, with gold-plated bathroom fixtures shaped like elegant swans, a detail she defended by saying gold was easier for the stewards to polish than silver. My father's quarters were lined with pink Carrara stone and dark masculine woods. We had a formal dining room that could seat 30 guests in the middle of a hurricane, with every piece of crystal and porcelain secured by hidden velvet-lined brackets. The Sea Cloud was a miracle of contradiction. It was as rugged as a Cape Horn whaler on the outside, and as delicate as a Louis XVI salon on the inside. Our voyages were legendary, often lasting 6 or 9 months at a time. I remember the 1932 expedition to the Galapagos Islands. In an era before mass tourism, we were like the explorers of the Enlightenment. We dropped anchor in bays where the tortoises and iguanas had no fear of man. My mother would go ashore in her sensible khakis, a Leica camera around her neck, documenting the flora with the same precision she used to audit a factory. She was a woman who hated idleness. Even in the most remote corners of the earth, she was collecting data, collecting sites, collecting the sheer thrill of being where no one else could reach her. We sailed to Tahiti, through the Panama Canal, and up the rugged, jagged coastline of Alaska. On the Sea Cloud, the social hierarchy of New York and Palm Beach was suspended, replaced by the rhythms of the sea. Yet, dinner was always a formal affair. I can still see the table set with Irish linens and the Romanov silver she had begun to acquire, the candlelight flickering as the ship leaned into a steady trade wind. My mother would sit at the head of the table, the undisputed commodore of her own destiny. She loved the isolation. On the water, no one could bring her a subpoena, no one could demand a board meeting, and no one could surprise her. She controlled the weather, or so it seemed, through sheer force of will. Then came the voyage that changed everything, the journey to Leningrad and Moscow in 1937. By then, she was married to Joseph Davies, the American ambassador to the Soviet Union. The Sea Cloud sailed into the heart of the Bolshevik Revolution like a white ghost from a vanished age. We docked at the Leningrad piers, and the contrast was staggering. On the shore was a nation of gray bread lines and secret police. On the water was a palace of capitalist splendor. The Soviet officials didn't know what to make of us. They would come aboard for lunch, their eyes wide as they took in the Murano chandeliers and the Venetian mirrors. My mother used the ship as a floating embassy. She understood that hospitality was the most potent form of diplomacy. She served them frozen American delicacies from General Foods, strawberries in the middle of a Russian winter, proving the superiority of her cold empire through a dessert spoon. She sat with Stalin's inner circle, women like Molotov's wife, and discussed the price of silk while her husband discussed the coming war. But there was a darkness beneath the glamour. Even on the Sea Cloud, we felt the eyes of the NKVD. My mother began to realize that the world was fracturing again. The beauty of the ship felt increasingly like a fragile bubble. She watched from the deck as the Soviet authorities began to sell off the treasures of the murdered Tsars, the porcelain, the icons, the Fabergé, treating them like junk to be traded for tractors. It was on the Sea Cloud that she made the decision to become a rescuer of history. She would use her fortune to buy back what the revolution was trying to erase. Every crate of art that was carried onto the ship's hold was a victory over the gray men of the Kremlin. The Sea Cloud era was the peak of my mother's romanticism. It was the only place where she seemed truly at peace, perhaps because the sea is the only thing larger than a $20 million inheritance. She often told me that when she was on the bridge of the ship, looking out at a horizon with no land in sight, she felt like the little girl in the Battle Creek barn again, simple, focused, and free from the expectations of the world. When the war finally reclaimed the ship in 1942, and it was stripped of its finery to become a weather station, my mother didn't cry. She viewed it as a necessary sacrifice. "The ship is a citizen," she said. It had carried the weight of her wealth across the world. Now it would carry the weight of a nation's defense. But for me, the Sea Cloud will always remain white, its sails filled with the breath of the 1930s, a floating fortress where my mother was not just an heiress, but a queen of the high seas, navigating a world that was rapidly disappearing beneath the waves. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the snap of the canvas and the call of the lookout. I see her standing at the rail, her eyes fixed on the distant line where the sky meets the water, always moving, always seeking the next port, always refusing to be anchored by anything less than the entire world. She had built a palace that could move, and in doing so, she had ensured that she would never be trapped by the very fortune she had spent her life protecting. Chapter 4. The Silk Trap and the Midnight Bells. The Forensic Architecture of Betrayal. To the public, the marriage of Marjorie Merriweather Post and Edward Francis Hutton was the ultimate American dream, a fusion of industrial royalty and Wall Street wizardry. They were the golden couple of the 1920s, the architects of General Foods, and the sovereigns of Mar-a-Lago. But by 1935, the gold had begun to tarnish, revealing a base metal of deceit. My father, E. F. Hutton, was a man of immense charm and even greater appetites, and he had committed the one sin my mother could never forgive. He brought disorder into her sanctuary. He did not merely break her heart, he insulted her intelligence. The atmosphere in our New York triplex and our Long Island estate, Hillwood, had turned glacial. I remember the silence at dinner, a silence so heavy you could hear the bubbles popping in the champagne. My mother was a woman of systems. She believed that life, like a factory, should run on a schedule of absolute transparency and efficiency. When my father began to disappear for hours without explanation, when his eyes began to wander during our gala balls, and when the whispers of the New York servants reached her ears, she didn't collapse into a fit of Victorian hysterics. She didn't hire a clumsy private investigator who might sell the story to the tabloids. Instead, she turned our home into a laboratory of counter-espionage. She knew that under the laws of New York at the time, a divorce required more than irreconcilable differences. It required proof of adultery, specific, undeniable, and documented. My mother, the woman who had audited the grain silos of Battle Creek at the age of 12, decided to audit her husband's infidelity. She approached the task with the same cold, methodical precision she used to acquire the Bird's Eye Company. She was not just a wife seeking the truth. She was a CEO gathering evidence for a hostile takeover. The Silk Trap, as I came to think of it, was a masterpiece of subtle engineering. My mother understood that the greatest betrayals happen in the dark, in the quiet corridors between bedrooms. She began by purchasing hundreds of yards of the finest silk thread so thin and translucent that it was virtually invisible to the naked eye. Each night, after the household had supposedly gone to sleep, she would move through the hallways like a ghost. She would stretch these threads across the doorways of my father's suite and the servants' quarters, anchoring them at ankle height with a dab of wax. If a door opened, if a foot stepped through a threshold, the thread would snap. It was a binary system of truth, intact or broken. But she didn't stop at threads. She knew that a broken thread could be explained away by a midnight trip to the kitchen or a restless walk. She needed to know who and where. This led to the midnight bells. She began to hang tiny silver bells, the kind used for fine needlework, behind the heavy velvet portieres and on the latches of the service entrances. These bells were tuned to a pitch that only a vigilant ear would catch. She spent her nights sitting in the darkness of her own suite, draped in a silk robe, listening for the faint, crystalline chime that would signal a breach of her domestic perimeter. The most ingenious part of her surveillance, however, was the talcum powder. My mother knew that footsteps leave a story that the tongue will try to deny. She began to sprinkle a fine, almost imperceptible layer of white talcum powder, the same powder she used after her bath, onto the polished mahogany floors in the hallways leading to my father's wing. She didn't cover the whole floor. She placed it strategically near the door frames and under the shadows of the console tables. I remember seeing her once, late at night, a silver sifter in her hand, her face as set and expressionless as a Roman bust. She wasn't a woman in mourning for a marriage. She was a woman executing a tactical plan. The talcum powder was her forensic ink. It would capture the unique tread of a slipper, the weight of a stride, and the direction of the betrayal. The target of this elaborate web was not some distant socialite or a Broadway starlet. It was closer to home, an insult of the highest order. My father had been conducting an affair with one of the household's own maids. To my mother, this was more than a moral failing. It was a security breach. It was the contamination of the Postum brand by a low-level employee. The climax of the investigation came on a humid night in 1935. The bells chimed, the threads snapped. The next morning, before the sun had even cleared the horizon, my mother was in the hallway with a magnifying glass. The talcum powder told the story in stark, white footprints. My father's heavy, confident step leading into a room that was not hers, and the smaller, lighter prints of the maid meeting him halfway. The geometry of the betrayal was perfect. The evidence was irrefutable. When she confronted him, she didn't raise her voice. She simply presented the audit. She showed him the broken threads, the recorded chimes, and the photographs she had taken of the footprints in the powder. My father, the great E.F. Hutton, the man who could move markets with a single word, found himself silenced by a dusting of bath powder and a handful of silver bells. He had underestimated the little girl from the Battle Creek boardrooms. He thought he was playing a game of hearts. He didn't realize he was being scrutinized by a woman who viewed a marriage contract with the same gravity as a corporate merger. The divorce was handled with the same terrifying efficiency. There were no public scenes, no tabloid leaks. My mother saw to that with a phalanx of the most expensive lawyers in the country. She didn't want his money. She had her own. She wanted his exit. She stripped him of his position at General Foods. She claimed full ownership of Mar-a-Lago and the Sea Cloud, and she ensured that his presence in her life was erased as cleanly as one wipes a chalkboard. I watched her during those months. She was 48 years old, at the height of her beauty and power, and she was utterly alone in her triumph. She had protected the empire, but at the cost of the last shred of her domestic innocence. She had used the silk trap to catch a predator, but in doing so, she had proven that even in her own home, she had to be the warden. I remember her standing in the living room of our New York apartment after the final papers were signed. She was wearing a string of pearls that had once belonged to a queen, her posture as straight as a mast on the Sea Cloud. She looked at me and said, "Nadinia, never allow a man to think his presence is more important than your order. A house that cannot be audited is a house that will eventually collapse." She had won. She kept the houses, the yacht, the corporate throne, and her dignity. But as I sat in the library later that night, I realized that the midnight bells would never truly stop ringing in her head. She had learned that even the most beautiful silk thread can be a cage, and that the only person she could truly trust to keep the ledger was herself. My father was gone, but the system she had built to catch him remained. A forensic architecture of suspicion that would define her relationships for the rest of her life. She was moving faster than the gunshot again, but this time, she was running through a house where every hallway was a trap and every shadow held a secret. Chapter 5. The Moscow Mission. Spaso House. The Red Purge. And the resurrection of the Romanovs. If the silk trap had taught my mother that her own home could be a place of surveillance, Moscow in 1937 taught her that an entire nation could be a panopticon. When her third husband, Joseph Davies, was appointed by President Roosevelt as the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, my mother did not merely pack a suitcase. She packed an entire civilization. She arrived in a Russia that was cannibalizing itself, a land where Stalin's Great Purge was in full, terrifying bloom. To the world, she was the ambassador's wife, a socialite in furs. But in the corridors of Spaso House, she was a cultural commando, navigating a labyrinth of microphones and secret police to rescue the discarded soul of Imperial Russia. We arrived at the Belaruski station in January, stepping off a train from Berlin into a frozen hell. The air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs. My mother, draped in sables, stood on that snow-covered platform with Joseph, surrounded by a swarm of photographers and the watchful, unblinking eyes of the NKVD. We were moved into Spaso House, a magnificent neoclassical mansion built for a wealthy merchant before the revolution. It had an 82-foot grand hall, crowned by a crystal chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of diamonds. But the beauty was a mask. Within 48 hours, my mother had conducted her own audit of the residence. She didn't find silk threads or talcum powder this time. She found the electronic ears of Joseph Stalin. The house was a sieve of surveillance. Microphones were embedded in the intricate plasterwork of the fireplaces, hidden behind the ventilation grills, and tucked into the very walls between the guest rooms. The Soviet domestic staff, every butler, every maid, every cook, reported directly to the Lubyanka. My mother's response was a masterpiece of defiance. She refused to whisper. Instead, she turned diplomacy into a loud, unapologetic performance of American capitalism. She and Joseph spent their own money to rewire the house, installing American bathtubs and modern appliances. But she knew the ears remained. She instructed us to never discuss sensitive matters unless we were tapping a silver spoon against a glass or a metal plate. A rhythmic clink, 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 intended to scramble the listening devices. I remember dinner parties where the atmosphere was a bizarre mix of caviar and paranoia, where a guest might lean over and whisper a secret while my mother rhythmically struck a baccarat crystal goblet with a spoon, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if challenging Stalin himself to listen closer. She understood instinctively that hospitality was her greatest weapon. She decided to out-prestige the Bolsheviks. While the people of Moscow waited in bread lines, my mother imported 2,000 pints of frozen cream and thousands of pounds of frozen meats and vegetables from her own General Foods factories in America. She hosted 5-hour luncheons and grand dinners where Soviet commissars, men who had spent their youth in frozen Siberian cells, were served strawberries in January. She watched them. She watched Molotov and Litvinov as they sat at her table, their faces as hard as Ural granite, while they consumed the delicacies of the empire they claimed to despise. She was selling America through a dessert spoon. She made no secret of her wealth. She wore her Cartier diamonds and her Marie Antoinette pearls to meetings with the proletariat. She knew that Stalin respected power, and she presented herself as the sovereign of a different kind of empire. The Soviets responded with a strange, grudging respect. They liked the Davises because they weren't bleeding heart liberals. They were frank, unapologetic capitalists who knew the value of a dollar. But while the luncheons continued, the Great Purge was screaming outside the gates. Joseph would go to the Hall of Columns to witness the show trials, watching as old Bolsheviks like Bukharin confessed to impossible crimes before being led to the basement to be shot. My mother stayed away from the trials, but she felt the darkness. She saw the GPU cars, the black vultures of the secret police, parked discreetly at the end of the birch-lined road near the embassy. She knew that the people she spoke to one day might vanish the next. It was in this atmosphere of liquidation that she found her true mission. The Soviet government, desperate for hard currency to fund their industrialization and their 5-year plans, was selling off the treasures of the czars. They viewed the heritage of the Romanovs as bourgeois refuse, gold and porcelain that could be converted into tractors and tanks. They opened the doors of state commissions and secret warehouses to my mother, the woman with the American dollars. I remember going with her to these antiquariat shops. They were dim, dusty caverns filled with the ghosts of 1917. In one corner, There would be a heap of liturgical vestments, embroidered in gold thread and encrusted with river pearls, tossed aside like dirty laundry. In another, silver chalices that had held the wine of the Orthodox Eucharist were being sold by weight, their artistic value ignored. My mother moved through these ruins with a religious fervor. She wasn't just shopping, she was a rescuer. She would find an icon, its face darkened by centuries of incense, and she would touch the silver riza with a trembling finger. "They are going to melt this down, Nadinia," she would whisper, her voice tight with fury. "They are going to destroy 1,000 years of history for the price of a rail spike." She began to buy. She bought systematically, with the same ledger-driven focus she used at General Foods. She acquired the Catherine the Great egg, a pink enamel masterpiece by Fabergé, and the nuptial crown of Empress Alexandra, the very diamonds that had adorned the last Tsarina on her wedding day. She rescued 80 dining services from the Imperial Porcelain Factory, pieces that had been commissioned for the tables of Peter the Great. She bought icons by the dozen, silver chalices by the crate, and portraits of the Romanovs that had been slashed by Bolshevik bayonets. The Soviet officials were happy to take her money. To them, she was a foolish American buying dead things. To her, they were the barbarians at the gate, and she was the one holding the line for civilization. She had a specialized team of packers who worked in the basement of Spaso House, building reinforced wooden crates that were lined with zinc to protect the treasures on the long journey across the sea. Every night, the sound of hammering echoed through the embassy, a rhythmic, defiant counterpoint to the silence of the purge outside. By the time we left Moscow in June 1938, she had assembled the most significant collection of Russian imperial art outside of the Soviet Union. She had saved fragments of a murdered empire from being ground into the dust of history. As the sea cloud sailed away from the Soviet docks, laden with dozens of heavy crates, my mother stood on the bridge, looking back at the receding spires of the Kremlin. She had faced down Stalin's microphones, she had fed the executioners, and she had outmaneuvered the liquidators. She understood that while a person can be killed, the beauty they created is the only thing that can truly survive a revolution. Those treasures weren't just things to her. They were proof that order, elegance, and history could endure even the darkest gunshot. She had gone to Moscow as an ambassador's wife, but she left as the custodian of a vanished world. She had used her fortune to ensure that when the gray men were gone, the light of the Tsars would still shine in a house called Hillwood. She told me once, much later, as she looked at a Fabergé box in the library. "In Russia, I learned that a ledger isn't just for money. It's for the soul of a people. If you don't count what is precious, the world will forget it ever existed." She never forgot. She spent the rest of her life counting, preserving, and protecting those ghosts, moving always faster than the destruction, long enough to turn a rescue mission into an immortal legacy. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Splendor. Mar-a-Lago and the Coral Ridge of Dreams. In the early 1920s, my mother decided that the world was too small, and the available architecture was too timid. She had already conquered the American breakfast table. Now, she sought to conquer the very landscape of Florida. The result was Mar-a-Lago, Spanish for sea to lake, a structure that defies the word mansion and enters the realm of myth. It was not built. It was conjured from 17 acres of scrubland and coral rock, a 126-room fortress of fantasy that served as the ultimate stage for the Marjorie Merriweather Post era. If Hillwood was her treasury and the sea cloud her escape, Mar-a-Lago was her proclamation of sovereignty. The story begins with dissatisfaction. The first house my mother built in Palm Beach, a villa called Hoguito, was deemed too small almost the moment the paint dried. It sat on a golf course, hemmed in by the expectations of others. My mother wanted a horizon. In 1924, she found a narrow strip of land stretched between the Atlantic Ocean to the east and Lake Worth to the west. It sat upon a coral reef ridge, the highest natural point on the island. At the time, it was a wilderness of palmettos and spiders. But where others saw a swamp, my mother saw a Mediterranean dream. She purchased the land for a pittance during the land boom and prepared to spend $7 million. over 100 million in today's currency, to tame it. To build her palace, she ignored the safe academic architects of the day. She didn't want a proper house. She wanted a performance. She hired Marion Sims Wythe for the structure. But for the soul of the house, she turned to Joseph Urban. Urban was not an architect by trade. He was a set designer for the Metropolitan Opera and the Ziegfeld Follies. He was a man who understood how to manipulate space, light, and emotion to create a sense of the extraordinary. My father, E.F. Hutton, was horrified. He saw a budget that was spiraling into the stratosphere. But my mother saw a canvas. She told the architects, "I don't want a house that looks like it was built yesterday. I want a house that looks like it has stood here for 500 years and survived every storm of history." The construction was a feat of industrial-age logistics. Over 600 workers swarmed the site, including 300 skilled craftsmen brought directly from Europe to ensure the masonry and woodwork met her postum-perfect standards. The materials themselves were a catalog of global antiquity. 3 boatloads of Doria limestone were shipped from Genoa, Italy. This fossil-bearing stone was soft enough to be carved into intricate bas-reliefs of griffins and gargoyles, yet it aged rapidly, giving the new walls the weathered patina of a 16th-century castle. But the obsession went deeper. My mother had acquired a collection of nearly 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, some dating back to the 15th century, from the estate of a sugar magnate. These weren't just decorative accents. They were the DNA of the house. Every room, every cloister, every staircase was designed around these tiles. She would spend hours at the site, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, pointing her parasol at a wall and demanding that 1,000 tiles be moved 2 inches to the left because the rhythm of the pattern was off. The roof was another feat of historical salvage. She didn't want new tiles. She wanted the sun-baked, salt-crusted history of the Caribbean. She purchased 20,000 roofing tiles from old Cuban buildings, their colors ranging from a faded salmon pink to a deep, weathered crimson. When they arrived, they were covered in moss and centuries of dust. My mother insisted they be installed exactly as they were, moss and all, to ensure the house felt rooted in the earth. To floor the dining room, she imported 2,200 square feet of black and white marble from a castle in Cuba. Even the native cypress trees on the property were sandblasted to give them the appearance of ancient, storm-beaten timber. Mar-a-Lago was designed to be hurricane-proof, a fortress disguised as a fairy tale. The walls were constructed of hollow ceramic tile, 16 inches thick, reinforced with concrete and steel, and anchored directly into the coral reef. But inside, the fortress vanished into a world of gold, leaf, and silk. The main living room stretched beneath a 42-foot ceiling, with a gold-leafed sunburst that seemed to trap the Florida light even after sunset. Every bathroom featured gold-plated fixtures, not out of mere vanity, but because my mother, with her practical business mind, knew that gold does not tarnish in the salt air. "It is a matter of maintenance," she would say to my father's protests. "Gold is cheaper than the labor required to polish silver every morning." The house was a labyrinth of 58 bedrooms and 33 bathrooms. Each suite had a theme. My sister Adelaide's suite was a colonial dream. The Dutch suite was a tribute to our mother's heritage. But for me, her youngest, Nadinia, she and Joseph Urban created the baby house. It was a suite designed like a fairy tale, with pink roses climbing up a beehive-shaped fireplace and door handles shaped like squirrels. It was beautiful, but it was also a stage. I grew up in a house where every hallway felt like a scene change, and every meal was a choreographed event. Dinner at Mar-a-Lago was the pinnacle of my mother's social engineering. We would arrive in mid-January, following the frost south like royalty. The staff of 60, 30 for the house, 30 for the grounds, would have the estate running with the precision of a Swiss watch. Guests would arrive at the great porte cochere, and the experience would begin. My mother would sit at the head of the marble table, surrounded by her rescued Romanov porcelain and her French gold boxes. She used the house to collect people. She brought together generals, actors, diplomats, and titans of industry, mixing them like the ingredients in a recipe to see what kind of conversation would cook. She once hosted the entire Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus on the front lawn. I remember elephants grazing on the manicured grass and acrobats swinging from the palms. She invited the underprivileged children of Palm Beach to watch the show alongside the richest families in America. It was a grand, theatrical gesture that summed up her philosophy. Magnificence is not a sin. It is a responsibility. She believed that if you had the means to create beauty, you had the obligation to share it, on your own terms, of course. My father, E.F. Hutton, eventually grew weary of the scale of it all. He famously complained that the building estimates weren't worth the paper they were written on. The house was a drain on his nerves. But for my mother, it was her crowning achievement. It was the only place where she could truly be the American Empress. She built 3 bomb shelters into the foundation, reflecting the anxieties of a woman who had seen how quickly empires could fall. She was always preparing for the next gunshot, the next revolution, the next collapse. Mar-a-Lago was her bunker, wrapped in Spanish silk and Italian stone. As I sit here in Hillwood, looking at the photographs of those golden Florida winters, I realize that Mar-a-Lago was my mother's way of defying the fleeting nature of time. She took the rubble of old Europe and the dust of Cuba and turned it into an American monument. She wanted it to be a winter White House, a place where presidents could find the same order and beauty that she had spent her life cultivating. She eventually left it to the United States government, a gift to the nation that had made her serial fortune possible. The fact that the government later returned it because they couldn't afford the maintenance is a testament to the sheer scale of her vision. Mar-a-Lago was too big for the state. It was only just big enough for Marjorie Merriweather Post. It remains today a place of gold and coral, a silent witness to a woman who refused to live in a small world. She built it to last 1,000 years, and every time the sun hits that 75-foot tower, I see her standing there, a parasol in one hand and a ledger in the other, commanding the sea and the lake to stay exactly where she put them. Chapter 7. The Choice of the Rebel. From the boardroom to the backlot. The birth of Dina Merrill. If my mother, Marjorie, spent her life building fortresses of stone and grain, then I spent the first half of mine looking for the exit. Growing up between the marble cloisters of Mar-a-Lago and the salt-sprayed decks of the Sea Cloud, I was not raised as a child, but as a primary asset. My mother looked at me and saw a successor, a Marjorie II, Zero who would inherit the mahogany chair at General Foods and command the ledgers with the same icy precision she had. But in my veins, the dry ink of corporate accounts had been replaced by the grease paint of the theater. My choice to become an actress was not just a career change. It was a coup d'etat against a destiny that had been mapped out for me before I could even walk. The friction began in my teens. My mother believed that for a woman at my station, power was the only reliable armor. She wanted me to study business administration, to master the intricacies of trust funds, and to understand the global logistics of the cold empire she had built with Birdseye. But I found my sanctuary in the drama department. I remember the first time I stood on a stage. The feeling of becoming someone else, someone who wasn't, the daughter of Marjorie Merriweather Post, was intoxicating. On stage, I didn't own millions. I owned the audience's breath. When I announced my intention to become a professional actress, the atmosphere at Hillwood turned colder than a Moscow winter. My mother looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that had stared down Stalin without blinking. She didn't scream. She never did. She simply said, in that voice of absolute quiet authority, "Nadinia, women of the Post family do not work for other people. We own the theaters. We do not stand upon the stage to entertain." To her, acting was a precarious, undignified profession, an unnecessary exposure, and above all, a waste of the intellect she had so carefully sharpened in me. But I had inherited one thing from her that she hadn't bargained for: an iron stubbornness. I knew that if I entered Hollywood as Nadinia Marjorie Hutton, I would forever be a dilettante heiress. Directors would look at my father's brokerage accounts instead of my performance. I would be cast as the girl in the gilded cage, a mere reflection of the life I was trying to outrun. So, I committed an act of identity theft. I decided to change my name. I chose the surname Merrill from a distant branch of the family tree and the name Dina because it sounded sharp and modern. The moment I signed my first contract as Dina Merrill, I felt like a thief who had stolen her own life back. I had effectively kidnapped myself from the Post legacy. My mother responded with a devastating, tactical silence. For years, the name Dina Merrill was never uttered within the walls of her homes. At Mar-a-Lago galas, if a guest asked about my career, she would deftly pivot the conversation to her latest acquisition of Sèvres porcelain or the progress of the National Symphony. She viewed my choice as a betrayal of my grandfather, C.W. Post's struggle. She couldn't fathom why I would choose the insecurity of auditions, the vulnerability of being rejected by a casting director, over the absolute security of a corporate throne. My life in Hollywood was far from the pampered existence people imagined. I purposely hid my background. I lived in a small apartment, drove myself to the backlots, and stood in line like any other girl from Ohio. There were nights when I sat in the dark, wondering if I was insane. I could have been sleeping on silk sheets at Hillwood with a staff of 60 to attend to my every whim. Yet here I was, worrying if I'd get a 3-line part in a B-movie. But in those moments of struggle, I actually felt closest to my mother. I was applying her own formula, building an empire from scratch. She had built General Foods. I was building Dina Merrill. I was using the discipline she had instilled in me. The punctuality, the attention to detail, the refusal to accept no, to navigate an industry that was just as shark-infested as Wall Street. The turning point came when the world stopped seeing a socialite and started seeing an actress. When I starred in Desk Set with Katharine Hepburn and the Sundowners, the secret finally leaked. The press delighted in discovering that Hollywood's new aristocrat was the daughter of the richest woman in America. My mother could no longer ignore me. I remember an evening at Hillwood when she called me into the library. She was holding a magazine with my face on the cover. She looked at me for a very long time, then sighed, a sound that contained both disappointment and a begrudging spark of pride. "You have your father's name and my will, Dina," she said, using my stage name for the first time. "If you have decided to be a product on a screen, then ensure you are the most expensive product in the house." That was our unofficial truce. She never liked my profession, but she began to respect my professionalism. She realized I hadn't abandoned the Post legacy. I had simply expanded it into a territory she couldn't control. I used the elegance she taught me to define the Hollywood socialite archetype, becoming the personification of old money on film. The irony, of course, was that even in Hollywood, I was playing her. Directors cast me as powerful, refined, and untouchable women. I was portraying my mother in every frame, using her posture, her mannerisms, and her icy gaze. I had run away from the boardroom only to recreate it on a soundstage. My choice to become Dina Merrill taught me that true wealth isn't held in a trust fund. It's held in the right to define oneself. I traded a name worth hundreds of millions for a name I earned myself. My mother eventually understood that by becoming Dina Merrill, I was moving faster than the gunshot in my own way. I wasn't just a rich girl dallying in the arts. I was a Post woman, and we never do anything halfway. I had taken the baby house girl and turned her into a Hollywood institution, proving that even if you are born in a palace, you still have to learn how to command the stage. Chapter 8. The Last Scandal and the Reclamation of Self. Herbert May, the poolside photographs, and the return to Post. If my mother's life was a grand opera, then her fourth marriage to Herbert Arthur May was the discordant final act that forced her to bring the curtain down on the very idea of shared power. By 1958, Marjorie Merriweather Post was 71 years old. She had outlived the trauma of her father's death, survived the betrayal of E.F. Hutton, and navigated the geopolitical minefields of Stalinist Russia. She was, by all accounts, a woman who should have been beyond the reach of scandal. Yet, her relentless pursuit of a handsome man, that same aesthetic obsession she applied to her Fabergé eggs, led her into a trap that would humiliate her more deeply than any previous infidelity. This is the story of how the Empress of Mar-a-Lago realized that even the largest fortune could not purchase a man's true nature, and how she finally found her strength in the name she was born with. The marriage to Herbert May began under the illusion of a shared sunset. He was a Pittsburgh industrialist, a vice president of Westinghouse, and a man of impeccable social standing. He was 6 feet of silver-haired, fox-hunting elegance, exactly the kind of living statue my mother loved to display in her homes. After the erratic brilliance of Joseph Davies, she longed for someone who spoke the language of American industry and could waltz through a Washington gala with the practiced ease of an aristocrat. They married in June of 1958, a lavish affair that the press hailed as the union of 2 titans of the old guard. But the cracks appeared almost as soon as the honeymoon ended. Herbert had his own money and, more importantly, his own stubborn will. He didn't want to be another artifact in Marjorie's collection. He rebelled against her General Foods discipline, the 15-minute cocktail hour, the rigid seating charts, the absolute authority she exercised over every candle and every napkin. Herbert wanted more booze, more spontaneity, and more freedom. He began to spend more time by the pool at Mar-a-Lago, away from the watchful eyes of the staff. Or so he thought. The tragedy of this marriage wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a fundamental deception. In the early 1960s, the photographs arrived. To this day, the memory of that moment at Hillwood makes my blood run cold. My mother, a woman who valued straight thinking and order above all else, was confronted with explicit evidence of Herbert's double life. Someone, a blackmailer or a disgruntled witness, had captured images of Herbert at the Mar-a-Lago pool in the company of younger men, in poses that left no room for doubt or denial. The humiliation was total. In the 1960s, such a revelation was not just a domestic crisis, it was a social death sentence. For my mother, it was a profound insult to her judgment. She had vetted him. She had invited him into her bed, her boardrooms, and her bank accounts. To find that he preferred the company of men, and that he had been so reckless with her reputation, shattered her. But the deepest cut came from within the family. I had known. I had heard the whispers in Hollywood and the hushed conversations in Washington social circles about Herbert's proclivities before the wedding. I hadn't warned her. I thought she wouldn't listen. I thought the union might work regardless. I was afraid of her reaction. My silence was a breach of the very loyalty she demanded, and it created a rift between us that took years to heal. My mother handled the aftermath with the same clinical boardroom efficiency she used to dismantle E.F. Hutton. She didn't scream. She didn't grant him the satisfaction of a public spectacle. She activated her phalanx of lawyers and began the liquidation of Herbert May from her life. She testified in an Idaho courtroom in 1964, citing a funny lack of basic straight thinking that made life with him impossible. It was a masterpiece of understatement. She bought his silence, paid his medical bills when he later suffered a stroke, and provided him an apartment in Fort Lauderdale, far enough away to be invisible, close enough to be controlled. But then, she did something that shocked us all. She went to the court and petitioned to reclaim her maiden name. At 77 years old, after 4 husbands and 4 divorces, she declared that she was no longer Mrs. Close, Mrs. Hutton, Mrs. Davies, or Mrs. May. She was, and would forever be, Marjorie Merriweather Post. This was not a gesture of defeat. It was a declaration of independence. She realized that every man she had married had, in some way, been an attempt to fill the void left by the gunshot in 1914. She had spent decades trying to find a general to help her lead the empire, only to realize that she was the only general the empire ever needed. By returning to the name of her father, she was circling back to the barn in Battle Creek. She was saying that the only name that mattered was the one that she had built into a global power. For the rest of her life, she was simply Mrs. Post. She removed the portraits of her husbands from the prominent galleries and replaced them with more icons, more porcelain, more art. She turned her homes into monuments of her own singular vision. She realized that husbands were temporary, but a brand was eternal. She stopped trying to collect powerful men and started focusing exclusively on the preservation of history. The Herbert May scandal was the final gunshot that cleared the air. It allowed her to stop performing the role of a wife and start embracing the role of a sovereign. I remember her sitting in the library after the name change was finalized. She looked at a portrait of herself, the one where she is wearing the blue sash and the diamonds. "Nadenia," she said, her voice like a fine crystal. "A woman with a fortune is always a target for the weak, but a woman with a name, her own name, is an island. I have finally reached the shore." The final years of her life were defined by this solitude. She entertained more than ever, but she did it as an individual. She was no longer an ambassador's wife or a Wall Street spouse. She was the matriarch. She had survived the predators, the spies, and the deceivers, and she had emerged with her ledger intact and her name restored. She had moved faster than the first gunshot for 70 years, and she had finally outrun the need for a man's shadow. She was Marjorie Merriweather Post, the first and the last of her kind, and in her reclamation of that name, she found the only peace she had ever truly known. Chapter 9. Topridge. The Wilderness as a Stage. 68 buildings, one absolute will, and the Russian dacha in the woods. My mother's life was an exercise in the conquest of environments. She had tamed the corporate boardrooms of Michigan, the diplomatic circles of Moscow, and the coral ridges of Florida. But her most personal victory was over the wilderness itself. Camp Topridge, nestled on an esker between the Spectacle Ponds and Upper Street, Regis Lake, in the Adirondacks, was what she called a rustic retreat. To anyone else, a retreat meant a cabin and a fishing rod. To Marjorie Merriweather Post, it meant 68 buildings, 85 staff members, and a private funicular. Topridge was where the Empress went to play at being a pioneer, though it was a pioneering spirit that required a private chef and a butler for every guest. The property was an obsession that spanned 50 years. She first acquired the land in 1920, and like everything else she touched, it grew according to the scale of her ambition. There was no road to Topridge. To arrive was an act of high theater. Guests would fly into Saranac Lake Airport on her private Vickers Viscount, the Merriweather. From there, they were chauffeured to a private dock and ferried across the water by high-speed launch. At the base of the steep ridge, my mother had installed a covered 6-person funicular for her Aunt Molly, whose heart couldn't handle the climb. It was a mechanical marvel in the middle of the forest, a silver vein running up the mountain, delivering the elite of Washington and New York into a world of organized nature. The main lodge was a masterpiece of Adirondack Great Camp style, if that style had been inflated to the proportions of a cathedral. The living room was 80 by 100 feet, with ceilings rising 25 feet overhead. The walls were adorned with mounted trophies from her deep-sea fishing expeditions and an immense collection of Native American artifacts that she treated with the same curatorial gravity as her Romanov porcelain. Immense stone fireplaces, large enough for a man to stand inside, roared even in the height of summer, countering the cool mountain air. But the true genius of Topridge was the guest experience. My mother viewed herself as a general of hospitality. Each guest was assigned their own private cabin, each equipped with its own fireplace, a fully stocked bar, and a telephone connected to the main lodge. Most importantly, each cabin had its own butler. She had a system of call buttons installed, a technological umbilical cord that allowed a guest to summon a massage, a fishing guide, a tennis partner, or a dry martini with a single touch. She ran the camp with a discipline that would have made a Prussian officer envious. The staff of 85 was invisible, but omnipresent. They lived in their own separate village on the property, moving through the woods on unpaved paths so as not to disturb the wilderness illusion for the guests. After our return from Moscow in 1938, she added a new layer to this forest fantasy, the Russian dacha. She commissioned a log structure built in the traditional style of a Russian country house, complete with intricate fretwork and onion-domed details that seemed to have drifted over the North Pole from the outskirts of St. Petersburg. Inside was a massive Russian tile stove and icons she had rescued from the Bolsheviks. It was a bizarre, beautiful juxtaposition, the scent of Adirondack pine mixing with the memory of the Romanovs. It was her private sanctuary within a sanctuary, the place where she could sit in a rocking chair and contemplate the two empires she had outlived, her father's and the Tsar's. The guest list at Topridge read like a directory of 20th century power. I remember walking past General George C. Marshall as he studied a map by the lake, or seeing Prince Felix of Luxembourg discussing the future of Europe over a plate of trout. My mother used the isolation of the woods to facilitate the kind of conversations that couldn't happen in Washington. In the Adirondacks, away from the microphones and the press, she was the neutral sovereign. She would host square dances in the Great Hall, a hobby she took up in 1950, forcing the most powerful men in the world to don flannel shirts and learn the steps to a folk dance. It was her way of reminding them that in her domain, she set the rhythm. However, Topridge was also where I saw the loneliness of her position most clearly. She had built a world so perfect, so controlled, that it was almost impossible for anyone to truly penetrate the barrier of her wealth. She would walk the forest paths alone, her Leica camera in hand, documenting a bird or a flower with the same clinical detachment she used for a corporate audit. She had created a wilderness where no leaf was out of place, and in doing so, she had created a place where she was the only permanent resident. The 68 buildings were a testament to her need to house everyone she knew, yet she remained the solitary sun around which all these satellites orbited. She changed the name from Huttridge to Topridge after her divorce from my father, E.F. Hutton. It was a small act of erasure, a scrubbing of the ledger. She wanted the land to belong to her name, and her name alone. She maintained this wilderness stage for over 50 years, a feat of endurance that mirrored her career. As I look back, Topridge was the ultimate expression of her, moving faster than the gunshot philosophy. She had retreated into the deepest woods, yet she had brought the entire machinery of the Gilded Age with her, ensuring that even in the heart of nature, her order remained supreme. Chapter 10. The Final Ledger. The Loss of David, the Silence of Hillwood, and the Will of a Nation. The end did not come with a gunshot, but with a slow, agonizing silence. By the early 1970s, the woman who had transformed American breakfast and rescued the art of a fallen empire began to fade. Her memory, once a razor-sharp instrument of business, began to flicker like a candle in a drafty hallway. The Empress was retreating into herself. But before she left, she had one final, devastating encounter with the one thing her fortune could not stop: the sudden, senseless cruelty of the sea. In September 1973, my mother was 86 years old, confined to a wheelchair at Hillwood, the Washington estate she had turned into a living museum. She had already signed the papers to leave Hillwood to the Smithsonian Institution, intending for her resurrection of the Romanovs to belong to the American people. She had balanced the books, she had arranged the porcelain. She was ready for the final audit. Then came the news of my son, David. David was 23, a young man who possessed the same restless energy as his great-grandfather C.W. Post. On September 8th, he went out on Gardiner's Bay in a twin-engine racing boat. The Atlantic, the same ocean my mother had crossed so many times on the Sea Cloud, turned violent. The boat capsized, and David disappeared beneath the waves. For 4 days, we searched. My mother, in her state of declining health, was not told the full extent of the tragedy at first, but I believe she knew. She had spent a lifetime sensing the shifts in the atmosphere. The woman who had gripped the wheel of a sailing yacht in a gale could feel the storm in her own house. On September 12th, 4 days after David went missing, and 1 day before his body was finally recovered, my mother's heart simply stopped. She died as she had lived, with a sense of timing that was almost supernatural. She left the world just as the final by-kitch was unfolding, sparing her the knowledge of her grandson's death, or perhaps joining him in the dark. Grandmother and grandson were mourned together, a double blow to a family that had spent a century trying to build a fortress against loss. The final ledger of Marjorie Merriweather Post was a document of staggering generosity and terrifying control. She left $17 million to her 3 daughters, but the bulk of her $250 million fortune was transformed into a legacy for the nation. She gave Hillwood to the Smithsonian, Mar-a-Lago to the federal government, and Topridge to the state of New York. She wanted her houses to become institutions, her art to become an education, and her life to become a blueprint for how wealth should be handled. The world, however, was not as disciplined as she was. The Smithsonian returned Hillwood because they couldn't afford the upkeep. The government returned Mar-a-Lago for the same reason. It took the strength of the foundation she established, and the return of Hillwood to private control, to ensure her vision survived. Today, Hillwood stands exactly as she left it. The Catherine the Great egg still gleams in its case. The sables still hang in the closet. The Russian icons still watch over the library with their solemn silver eyes. As I sit here in this library for the last time before the tourists arrive, I realize that my mother achieved the impossible. She outran the gunshot. She took a $20 million tragedy and turned it into a cultural cornerstone. She was a woman who was often lonely, often misunderstood, and always formidable. She was the American Empress not because of what she owned, but because of what she refused to lose. She lies buried in the gardens of Hillwood, under a monument that bears her name, Marjorie Merriweather Post. No husbands' names are carved there, just hers, the name she reclaimed, the name she made eternal. I close my ledger now, the ink finally dries. The gunshot has faded into history, and all that remains is the beauty she rescued and the order she imposed upon a chaotic world. She was my mother, the sovereign of Postum, and she has finally found the one thing her fortune could never buy. A silence that is not empty, but full of the echoes of a life lived to its absolute, magnificent limit.